Tonight, we wander through candlelit corridors where the scent of wax and wine lingers in the air, where togas rustle just softly enough not to wake the mosaics beneath your feet. You step into Rome, not the tourist Rome, not the movie Rome, but the thick, breathing, contemplative Rome, the kind that whispers rather than roars. Statues leer from the corners, their marble eyes empty, yet somehow judgmental. Somewhere in the background, the aqueduct hums. And you are not a senator, or a soldier, or even a slave. You are the quiet observer, the one trailing behind emperors as they pace their corridors with heavy heads and heavier hearts. Because tonight's story isn't just about Rome's swords and sand, no, it's about the men behind the men, the ones with scrolls instead of shields, the ones whose ideas outlasted the palaces, the Greek philosophers, imported like fine marble, but much harder to sculpt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, post your location and local time in the comments so I know who else is out there with you in the dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking beside Augustus now, the first emperor, the one who claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, but even he, self-made, sharp, quietly ruthless, found himself drawn to the philosophies of the Greeks. Epicureanism, in his case. A belief in moderation, simple pleasures, and staying the heck out of politics, which is ironic given the whole emperor thing. He famously kept a statue of Epicurus in his study right beside the room where he made decisions that shaped continents. Some say he read Greek every night before bed, a little wine, a little wisdom, maybe even this very night 2,000 years ago. But Augustus wasn't alone. By his time, Greek philosophy had already wrapped its tendrils through Roman society like ivy on a marble column. Every educated Roman worth their salt or olive oil knew their Plato from their Pyrrho. The children of the elite were tutored in Greek, thought not Latin bluster. Cicero, long before Augustus, had already moaned in beautifully structured sentences about how Latin just didn't have the vocabulary for philosophy. Too many words for war, not enough for existential angst. So why did it matter? Because Rome conquered with its legions, but it ruled with its image. Power wasn't just about crushing uprisings and paving roads, it was about sounding clever at dinner parties. A philosopher at your side gave your reign polish. They were like spiritual stylists helping you match your ethics to your empire. You stop now at the Library of Alexandria, or rather what the Romans remembered of it. When Julius Caesar accidentally torched part of it during his civil war, he claimed it was an oopsie. Historians still argue whether that fire destroyed the entire archive or just a warehouse annex, but either way it was a perfect symbol. Rome was always flirting with Greece, sometimes reverent, sometimes reckless. You keep walking, past busts of Socrates, who was dead before Rome was even relevant, past Plato, who built thought systems that centuries of emperors would misunderstand gloriously, past Aristotle, the ultimate name drop in Roman speeches. These weren't just figures in dusty scrolls. They were voices in the heads of emperors, shaping their dreams, their fears, their letters, home to mom, assuming Roman emperors wrote to their mothers, which some did, and some probably should have more often. There's something almost amusing about it, isn't there? That the rulers of the mightiest empire in the ancient world kept looking backward toward a defeated, fragmented Greece for guidance on how to rule. Rome could conquer Sparta, sack Corinth, and strip Athens of its treasures, but it never stopped trying to be a good student. You pause now under a painted ceiling in a senator's home. Greek slaves serve wine. Greek tutors quiz children. Greek doctors diagnose diseases. And somewhere in the atrium, a bust of Socrates watches silently as a Roman boy learns to ask questions he'll never be allowed to answer in public. Because Roman emperors, for all their statues and military titles, often felt the pressure of pretending to be wise, pretending to be good, pretending not to be terrified, and the philosophers they offered a mirror, not always a flattering one, but a mirror nonetheless. Quirky tidbit. Some Romans took this admiration to absurd levels. Elite families hired Greek philosophers not just to tutor their children, but to attend dinner parties like intellectual accessories. If your guest list lacked a stoic, a cynic, and maybe one Epicurean for balance, you were considered culturally impoverished. Imagine hosting a dinner and worrying more about dialectics than dessert. So here you are, beginning your quiet descent into the minds behind the throne. The whisperers, the scrawlers, the men who dared to ask, what is virtue to people who owned half the world and were still somehow afraid of shadows? You keep moving now, your sandals scuffing gently against the stone as you pass beneath an arch that has seen centuries come and go. The air here grows thicker, almost warmer, like thought itself lingers in the marble. Because you're not just in Rome anymore, you're stepping into the long shadow cast by Greece. It's the kind of shadow you can't shake off, no matter how many triumphs you parade through the Forum. Long before Rome became an empire, before the legions fanned across Europe like iron fingers, there was Alexander the Great. Not Roman, not even close, but Rome couldn't stop thinking about him. He died young, left no plan for succession, and still somehow managed to haunt every Roman general who came after him. You hear his name in whispered admiration from Caesar, from Pompey, from Augustus himself. They wanted to be like him, except perhaps the dying in Babylon part. But more than his conquests, what made Alexander seductive was who educated him: Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. Student of Plato, teacher of kings. A man so meticulous he wrote essays on everything from logic to zoology, and probably could have made an argument for why olives should rule the world. Alexander grew up with his voice in his ear, telling him to think before he charged, to seek knowledge, not just glory. It didn't always work, but the myth was set: the best rulers are the ones who learn from philosophers. Rome picked up on that myth like a souvenir. Only instead of postcards, they brought home entire schools of thought, literal schools, physical philosophers carted back from Greece after every military campaign like cultural loot. While other soldiers were stuffing amphorae with wine or statues of naked heroes, the bookish ones were asking if they could bring back a guy who knew about logic and maybe some scrolls on ethical governance. You pause now beside a mosaic depicting a scene from Homer, probably added by a Roman who spoke Greek better than Latin. That wasn't uncommon. Educated Romans often preferred Greek. Some even insisted on using it in letters to show off. One emperor, Claudius, was reportedly mocked for not knowing enough Greek. And he was emperor. Imagine needing to pass a philosophy midterm just to stay in power. But this wasn't just academic posturing. The Greek worldview seeped into how Romans thought about fate, justice, power, even death. Stoicism, with its emphasis on inner calm and accepting one's role in the universe, became almost a civic virtue. It told emperors they were part of something greater than themselves. It told citizens that suffering could be noble, which, let's be honest, was a helpful message when you lived under emperors who could execute you for sneezing at the wrong time. Historians still argue whether Rome's obsession with Greece was admiration or overcompensation. Did they love Greek wisdom, or were they just trying to prove they were more than just good at stabbing things? Either way, they built temples to Apollo beside forums dedicated to conquest, and they never quite stopped quoting Plato, even when most of them misunderstood him entirely. Now picture this: a young Roman senator, maybe in his 20s, pacing through the Palatine Gardens. He's nervous. Tomorrow he's to speak in the Senate. He clutches a worn copy of a Greek treatise on rhetoric. His tutor, an old Athenian with more wrinkles than coins, sits calmly on a bench and reminds him not to shout, not to gesture too much, and not to get distracted by the smell of roast boar wafting up from the kitchens. That tutor, he's not just a hired mouthpiece, he's a remnant of an older world, one the Romans have conquered but can never quite own. Quirky detail for you. Roman statues of philosophers often showed them disheveled, bearded, wearing simple cloaks. Not flattering, but that was the point. Wisdom wasn't about fashion. In fact, looking too clean was suspicious. Real thinkers looked like they hadn't slept in weeks and were maybe one bad debate away from homelessness. If your philosopher didn't look like he was arguing with a tree at dawn, was he even a philosopher? And yet emperors craved their presence. They wanted that aura, that connection to something ancient and profound. You can almost hear the inner monologue of an insecure ruler. Yes, I taxed the provinces into oblivion and built a gold-plated bathhouse. But look, I also invited this man who studies virtue to dine with me. That counts for something, right? In truth, these Greek philosophers served many roles: advisors, tutors, therapists, distractions. They were expected to polish the emperor's image while also somehow keeping his soul intact. A near impossible job, especially when your boss might toss you off a balcony if you corrected his grammar. But the philosophers came anyway. They crossed seas, they endured mockery, they accepted strange Roman customs like eating dormice and voting on morality, because in some strange way Rome needed them, for legitimacy, for wisdom, for that quiet whisper in the dark that said you may rule the world but you didn't invent thought. And so you continue walking past a portico where Greek words echo faint and half-remembered. You smile, thinking how odd it is that an empire famous for gladiators and legions once paused to ask, but what would Socrates say? Now the sun sinks lower behind the Palatine Hill, and you find yourself wandering into the gardened peristyle of a Roman villa, not one of the marble-drenched monstrosities of later emperors, but a tasteful, stoic space. The home of Scipio Aemilianus, conqueror of Carthage, the man who leveled Rome's greatest enemy, and then invited the world's cleverest Greeks to dinner. You step lightly across the tiled floor, past fountains, murmuring in a language older than Latin, and into a room that was less a salon and more a quiet battlefield of ideas. Scipio's guest list read like a who's who of Hellenistic genius. Polybius, the Greek historian, forcibly relocated to Rome after losing a war. He didn't just become Scipio's friend, he practically became his ghostwriter. Cato the Elder grumbled about Greek infection, but here, in this house, Greek infection was the whole point. It wasn't just intellectual status, it was soul armor. Scipio had destroyed Carthage, true, but he also felt the weight of it. And who better to soothe your conscience after engineering cultural annihilation than a philosopher who could rationalize it in perfect Attic prose? Tonight, dinner begins in silence. Scipio reclines on a couch, wine in hand, eyes scanning the shadows where Polybius sits, wrapped in a threadbare cloak, one hand stroking his beard as he explains how constitutions evolve or collapse. There's Panatius, a stoic who manages to sip watered-down wine with the dignity of a man drinking ambrosia. He speaks not of war, but of virtue, courage, justice, temperance, wisdom, the things emperors pretend to value and philosophers pretend to define. You observe, unseen, a silent third party to this intellectual performance, a whispering flicker of candlelight over a scroll. The funny part, these Greek thinkers weren't always polite. Polybius once described Romans as brave, but crude. Panatius thought most of them misunderstood Stoicism so badly it should come with a warning label. Yet here they were invited guests, hired minds, moral makeup artists for a militaristic society trying very hard to look thoughtful. And yet Scipio wasn't faking it. He genuinely admired Greek thought. He hosted what some historians call Rome's first proper salon, complete with readings, debates, and just enough wine to keep things lively without tipping over into Cicero's infamous complaint that Roman banquets had more drunken posturing than meaningful conversation. Scipio tried to change that, and in doing so he bridged a strange cultural canyon, the conqueror showing reverence for the conquered, not out of guilt, but respect. That's the part that sticks with you. The Romans had crushed Greek military power, but couldn't seem to crush their own need to sit at Greek feet. There was a vulnerability to it, like a schoolyard bully secretly memorizing the poems of the kid he just stuffed into a locker. A quirky little detail from these dinners, Scipio was said to reenact scenes from Homer's Iliad, quoting them in Greek, sometimes even insisting on using a particular dialect to preserve the meter. Polybius would occasionally roll his eyes and correct him mid-recitation. That's a level of dinner-time tension you just don't get anymore, unless you've ever tried watching Jeopardy with a classics professor. But these dinners weren't just performance. They were therapy. Scipio had watched his father die in the Second Punic War. He had seen empires collapse, and when he destroyed Carthage, leveling it to the ground and salting its fields, he didn't brag. He walked away quieter, more thoughtful, more drawn to the soft, reflective logic of men who wrote, not fought. Historians still argue whether Scipio's philosophical side was genuine or calculated. Was it about reputation or remorse? Was it virtue or branding? The answer, of course, is that in Rome those were often the same thing. Outside, the crickets begin to chirp, though they're probably just the Roman version of crickets, more organized, maybe slightly judgmental. You step back from the dining room now, passing under an arch, where the words of Plato are etched above the door, not in Latin, but in Greek, a reminder that even the language of Rome bent just slightly in the presence of older thought. And here's the curious thing, this house Scipio's became a model, a sort of prototype for how elite Romans would curate their intellect. Later, generals, consuls, and emperors would mimic this exact layout, not just the architecture, but the ambience, the fusion of physical power and mental restraint, a place where military trophies shared space with philosophical scrolls. You find yourself wandering toward the courtyard, where an olive tree stands quietly in the corner. Under it, someone has left a copy of Panaetius's treatise on duty. The scroll is faded, half unraveled, and lightly smeared with wine. But the words are still readable. They say something about controlling anger, about serving the Republic, about accepting fate with a calm heart. You pause, because it's suddenly very clear this wasn't just dinner theatre. For men like Scipio Greek, philosophy wasn't a garnish, it was a guide, a way to make sense of Rome's contradictions, brutal conquests paired with public virtues, ruthless politics camouflaged as duty. Greece didn't just offer insight, it offered instruction, and sometimes instruction was all that kept the empire from devouring itself. You wander from Scipio's villa into the harder edges of imperial Rome, where the blood is a little fresher and the statues slightly more smug. This is a colder part of the story, less about intellectual salons and more about surviving the palace. The marbles cleaner here, polished to a shine that reflects not just your face but the deep, dark corners of power. And yet right in the heart of this ruthless machine, there it is again, Greek philosophy, lounging awkwardly beside the throne, trying to look casual while desperately whispering, "Maybe don't murder your uncle," because now you're standing at the shoulder of Lucius Annaeus Seneca, stoic philosopher playwright, and somehow Nero's tutor. It's a job that should have come with hazard pay and a panic button. Seneca taught Nero as a boy, fed him Cicero and Chrysippus, and Marcus's favorite moral bedtime stories, all in the hope that maybe, just maybe, philosophy would soften him. It didn't. But don't blame Seneca just yet. He tried. He really did. He taught Nero about temperance, justice, self-control, all the Stoic classics. He encouraged him to give public speeches about clemency and civic virtue. For a while it worked. Nero's first few years as emperor were surprisingly reasonable, quiet budgets, fairer taxes, even fewer executions than usual. People whispered that philosophy had tamed him. Seneca had done it. The philosopher had saved the emperor, and things started burning, literally and metaphorically. Historians still argue whether Nero set fire to Rome or simply fiddled while it happened, but what's clearer is that he stopped listening to Seneca. One day he was quoting Euripides, the next he was stabbing his mother. Seneca, meanwhile, wrote treatises on anger and grief, possibly while looking over his shoulder every 5 minutes. He kept sending Nero letters about virtue, restraint, mercy, like someone trying to stop a rabid dog by reading it poetry. And the weirdest part, Nero kept reading them, or at least pretending to. He even quoted Seneca in public. There's something deeply Roman about that, an emperor doing the opposite of what he says, but making sure it's phrased elegantly. He'd kill senators in the morning and praise stoicism by night. Seneca's words became performance art, used, misused, and weaponized. You're walking past the imperial archives now, scrolls upon scrolls, some philosophical, some political, some orders, for wine. Seneca's writings are tucked among them on the shortness of life, letters to Lucilius, on anger. In them he pleads with the reader to focus on what matters, to use time wisely, to live with integrity. He sounds like a man who knows the blade is already hanging over his head, and indeed it was. When Nero finally turned on Seneca, the execution wasn't loud, it was ceremonial. Nero told Seneca to kill himself. Stoics, you see, believed that suicide could be a rational act in the face of tyranny. Seneca, ever the philosopher, opened his veins and died as calmly as one can, while bleeding out in a marble bathtub. Tacitus claims he died speaking words of comfort to his friends, still tutoring to the bitter end. Whether that's true or poetic license, no one's quite sure, but it's stuck. Quirky fact, Seneca was obscenely rich. Like Elon Musk, levels of rich. He owned villas across Italy, dabbled in high-interest loans to British provinces, and made philosophical arguments against wealth while sipping wine more expensive than most temples. Stoic hypocrisy, probably. But in Rome, moral purity was less about consistency and more about dramatic flair. Still, the message of stoicism, of restraint, endurance, clarity, found a home in imperial Rome. Even among emperors, Marcus Aurelius, for instance, wasn't just a fan of stoicism, he was a stoic, the real deal. His personal writings, collected as meditations, read like diary entries from someone trying to stay sane while commanding the largest empire on earth. He reminds himself to be kind to idiots, to avoid flattery, to rise early and accept hardship. You could quote half of it on Instagram and pass it off as modern mindfulness. And yet Marcus was no quiet scholar. He spent much of his reign at war, wrapped in furs on the Germanic frontiers, writing philosophy by firelight while ordering troop movements. He was in many ways the anti-Nero, thoughtful, principled, and haunted by the weight of power. But even he, for all his wisdom, couldn't prevent the slow decline of the empire or stop his terrible son Commodus from turning Rome into a gladiator's playground. Philosophy might refine an emperor, but it can't rewrite the blood in his air. You walk now through a library wing. A bust of Marcus Aurelius watches you, beard, noble eyes, dreamy. Nearby a plaque reads, "From my grandfather Verus, I learned good morals and the government of my temper." That's Meditations Book 1. A list of mentors, almost all of them Greek in spirit if not in blood. Marcus knew he was standing in a long borrowed tradition. He didn't try to hide it. So what do you take from all this? Maybe that even the mightiest rulers needed someone to tell them gently and repeatedly, "You're not a god." Greek philosophers gave Rome a way to intellectualize restraint, to dress tyranny in robes of thought, to remind emperors they were temporary stewards of a world far older than they were. It didn't always work, but sometimes, just sometimes, it helped. The air changes slightly now. You've left behind the palaces and libraries, stepped out of senatorial gardens, and into a more chaotic, noisier Rome, the kind with street preachers shouting matchmakers, pickpockets, and philosophers who forgot to wear shoes. And here, right here beneath a cracked arch, and beside a statue missing both arms, you meet the most unlikely of dinner guests, the cynic. Not just any cynic, mind you, this one bathes sometimes. He's not quite as dramatic as Diogenes, the original cynic, who famously lived in a barrel and once told Alexander the Great to get out of my sunlight. But still, this guy sleeps under bridges, waves his staff at pigeons, and rants about virtue to anyone who will listen, including tonight a Roman emperor who is either curious, lonely, or deeply bored. You slip in behind the imperial retinue as it pauses beside the rostra. There stands the emperor, let's call him Hadrian, though it could just as easily be Antoninus Pius, or even young Commodus before the circus corrupted him. He listens, head tilted, as the cynic growls about hypocrisy. "You own everything and understand nothing," he says, jabbing his gnarled finger at a man who commands armies. "You wear silk, but your soul is threadbare." Instead of ordering the man's tongue cut out, because let's face it, many emperors would have you watch the emperor smirk. "Come to dinner," he says, "teach me something." And so the cynic does. He arrives barefoot, still muttering. The table is loaded with roasted dormice, honeyed dates, and chilled wine, but he touches none of it. Instead, he launches into a monologue about false needs, quoting Socrates and maybe making up the rest. The courtiers fidget. The emperor, intrigued, asks him why he lives in squalor. To remind men like you, the cynic says that freedom does not come with guards. Now here's the quirky bit. This scene actually happened more than once. Roman emperors, especially the more cerebral ones like Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, had a habit of inviting eccentric philosophers to court just to be insulted. Some did it to test their own egos, some to perform humility, some just for the intellectual sport of it. It was almost a party trick. Bring me the man who sleeps with dogs. Let's see what he says about my new toga. Historians still argue whether these encounters were sincere or carefully choreographed political theatre. Was it honest curiosity or just another way to appear enlightened? Either way, the cynics never held back. They insulted emperors to their faces and somehow lived to tell the tale, at least when the emperor had a sense of humor. When they didn't, well, let's just say barrels are flammable. Cynicism as a Greek school of thought rejected social conventions. It called wealth a burden, titles a farce, and empires a distraction from virtue. Diogenes himself allegedly wandered around Athens with a lantern in broad daylight looking for an honest man. He never found one, but he became the kind of figure even Romans couldn't ignore. They admired his audacity even as they feared his indifference. To the Roman mind, which so prized hierarchy and decorum, the cynic was terrifying, not because he was powerful, but because he wanted nothing. You walk now through the Subura district, Rome's gritty underbelly. Here, philosophy doesn't wear robes, it smells like fish and politics, but even here, the influence of Greek thought lingers. A beggar mutters lines from Euripides. A boy recites Epictetus while dodging mule carts. The ideas have seeped into everything. And yet, even as cynics scoffed at emperors kept listening. There was something irresistible about being challenged. In a world where no one told you no, where your every word was echoed and gilded, a scowling Greek muttering about virtue in the gutter might be the only honest thing you hear all day. This brings you inescapably to one of the strangest dynamics in Roman history: emperors craving simplicity. They ruled vast territories, controlled legions, drained rivers, and renamed months, but they longed for peace of mind. And Greek philosophy, even the wild-eyed, cynic kind, offered a chance at that. A reminder that power didn't have to mean corruption, that perhaps buried beneath the layers of ritual and violence, a noble soul could still exist. You stand now in the atrium of a modest villa owned by a retired consul. He's not powerful anymore, but he keeps a bust of Diogenes near his writing desk. A reminder, perhaps, that the voice of dissent is more useful than the silence of sycophants. He doesn't quote him often. Diogenes is a bit much before lunch, but he knows it's better to hear uncomfortable truths than to be flattered into failure. And this is where the cynics, ridiculous as they sometimes seemed, found their power. Not in politics, not in libraries, but in their ability to shame emperors into thinking just for a moment that they might be wrong. So the next time you imagine Rome as a place of rigid order and marble seriousness, remember the barefoot man barking about virtue while the emperor pours his wine and listens, trying desperately to understand what it means to be free. You ease back into the quieter quarters of Roman power, now past the noise of marketplaces and cynic outbursts, into the cooler hush of columned libraries and marble-inlaid study rooms. The floors here are mosaicked with scenes from battles long forgotten, but the walls, they're lined with scrolls, hundreds, maybe thousands of them each one, a whisper from a Greek philosopher to a Roman who couldn't stop reading. Here, in the shade of imperial estates and wealthy villas, you feel a different kind of conquest taking place, not with legions but with language, not with shields but syllogisms. Rome conquered the Greek world with its armies, yes, but Greece invaded back softly, permanently, through thought. You step into a domus where the atrium smells faintly of olive oil, papyrus, and overripe figs. A young boy recites from memory a passage of Plato while a retired general corrects his pronunciation. The irony is palpable. This boy might never see battle, and the general hasn't opened a scroll in years, but still, here they are, partaking in a tradition imported from the lands they claimed to rule. The classroom, like the battlefield, is now Greek terrain. It happened slowly, like ivy creeping up a wall. At first, Greek philosophers came to Rome as war booty. After Rome sacked Corinth in 146 BCE, hundreds of scholars, poets, and thinkers were shipped west like spoils. But instead of fading into obscurity, they began tutoring senators' sons, running public lectures, and publishing translated works that mixed Greek clarity with Roman ambition. They taught logic in the basilicas and ethics in the atriums. Over time, these minds became fixtures of elite Roman households, ornaments with opinions hired not just for knowledge, but for prestige. You pass a villa with frescoes of Socrates and Zeno above the family hearth. Greek myths are etched onto the cups, and in the corner, an enslaved pedagogue, a Greek of course, carefully prepares tomorrow's lesson in stoic ethics. This wasn't just fashion, it was ideology installed into the next generation like software. And with each lesson, Greece reclaimed a little ground. The Romans, practical as always, loved utility. They weren't going to philosophize in circles just for the fun of it. They needed ideas that served a purpose, advice for ruling, frameworks for law, templates for behavior. And the Greeks had plenty to offer. Plato gave them models of justice. Aristotle laid out systems for governance. The Stoics handed them courage, the Epicureans gave them calm, and the skeptics, well, they reminded them that certainty is dangerous in politics. A quirky little shift occurred here as Roman generals marched east. Roman philosophy marched eastward too, but dressed in Greek robes. Emperors began building libraries in the cities they conquered, not just to civilize the locals, but to display their own sophistication. Ephesus, Pergamon, Alexandria, they weren't just military prizes, they were campuses of thought, and the Romans treated them accordingly. You stop now in the shade of a tall bronze statue of Athena, erected not by Greeks but by a Roman governor. She's no longer holding a spear but a scroll, and behind her a portico inscribed in both Latin and Greek. It's the visual symbol of a cultural merger that never quite balanced. Rome had the muscle, but Greece still had the mind. Take the libraries, for instance. Julius Caesar, ever the reformer, once proposed building a public library in Rome, rivaling those in the East. It was Gaius Asinius Pollio, another military man turned scholar, who finally did it using war spoils to fund a temple to knowledge. That's a very Roman thing to do, turn looted treasure into bookcases. The Forum of Trajan later had its own dual-language library, one side in Latin, the other in Greek, a split so symbolic it could have been a TED Talk. Historians still debate whether these libraries were actually used or merely symbolic. Did the average Roman senator actually read Greek tragedy, or just name-drop Euripides at parties? Did emperors quote Plato because they understood him, or because it made them look less like tyrants and more like philosopher kings? The evidence leans both ways. Some really read, others really pretended, but the books remained even when the readers vanished. And that's the thing, Greek thought became Rome's conscience, even if selectively applied. It didn't stop wars or executions or corruption, but it gave the ruling class something to aspire to. A template of virtue, even if it was printed on very slippery marble. One amusing example. The philosopher Musonius Rufus once lectured Roman soldiers on self-control and vegetarianism. Yes, the same men who crushed rebellions were now being told to give up garlic-stuffed sausages and contemplate the morality of onions. To their credit, some listened. Others just snuck meat behind the latrines. You step now into a governor's residence in Antioch. The man there is dictating a letter to Rome in Latin, while his son practices Plato's Republic in Greek. A tutor corrects the boy. No, not democracy is chaos. Say it in the original. The boy rolls his eyes, but complies. This is Rome's east now, but really it's Greece, still whispering behind the walls. And all the while the scrolls multiply. They were copied by hand, recited aloud, scribbled in margins. Philosophers traveled with emperors not just as advisors, but as mobile libraries. When Galen, the physician-philosopher, journeyed with Marcus Aurelius to the northern frontiers, he carried books by the dozen, probably much to the annoyance of whichever poor legionary was assigned to haul them through Germanic mud. Rome had its gods, its monuments, its weapons, but Greece gave it a vocabulary for doubt, for discipline, for mortality. That's what the philosophers offered, ideas too sharp to wear out and too slippery to pin down. You linger now in a silent library just outside the Campus Martius. It smells of dust and beeswax. A single oil lamp flickers. On the desk, someone has left open a scroll by Epictetus, the former slave turned stoic teacher. It says, "We are not disturbed by events, but by the views we take of them." And you smile. Because that one sentence explains why Rome, with all its might, still clung to the words of men whose only weapons were questions. Now the path darkens. You step carefully over the mosaic floor where vines and laurels curl underfoot, but this time the silence feels heavier. The air is cooler, laced not with incense or oil, but with something more uncertain, like anxiety, pressed between the lines of a letter never sent. Because here, under the polished surfaces of Stoic aphorisms and Epicurean calm, lies a sharp truth. In Rome, philosophy could elevate you, but it could also get you killed. You find yourself walking the corridors of power, but not the kind adorned with garlands and laughter. No, this is the long hallway behind the throne, where whispers count for more than applause, and every philosopher is either a trusted advisor or a very educated threat. There's a pattern you begin to notice if you squint just right. Emperors admired philosophy when it suited them and destroyed it when it didn't. Just ask Seneca, whose calm words couldn't save him from Nero's twitching paranoia. Or Thrasea, a Stoic senator who believed so strongly in personal virtue and moral integrity that he politely refused to flatter Nero. His reward, execution. Not for treason, not for rebellion, but for silence. That's the part that rattles in Rome. Even not speaking could be fatal. The Stoics in particular had a rough time under emperors who preferred nodding heads to critical minds. Their ideas, endurance, duty, inner freedom, were irresistible to citizens trying to survive corruption. But they were equally irritating to emperors who heard every lesson in virtue as a passive-aggressive jab. Under Vespasian and Domitian, philosophers were expelled from Rome, literally deported. Not because they led armies, but because they made people think about power. And yet they kept returning. Like ethical weeds, like conscience in sandals. Even when exiled, they wrote, they debated, they taught. Epictetus, once enslaved and later banished, simply moved to Nicopolis and opened a school that attracted Roman elites like moths to a moral flame. His lectures were blunt, unimpressed by wealth or titles. It's not the emperor who controls you, he'd say, but your reaction to him. That didn't go over well in every circle. You pause now beside a marble bust with no name, just a chiseled beard and the faint outline of worry across the brow. Maybe he was a senator, maybe a teacher, maybe both. Rome liked to blur those lines and sometimes erase them entirely. You wonder how many philosophers were turned into statues, not because of what they said, but because it was safer to remember them in stone than to listen to them alive. Here's a quirky bit for you. When Domitian banned philosophers, one man, Helvidius Priscus, continued attending Senate meetings just to sit silently. He'd show up robed and dignified and say nothing, a protest of presence. Eventually the emperor executed him anyway. Apparently quiet virtue is even more dangerous than loud opposition. It's harder to mock, harder to twist, and most of all, harder to ignore. Historians still argue whether this philosophical resistance was effective. Did it change laws, save lives, or was it just symbolic, a doomed effort to inject morality into a system built on domination? There's no clean answer, but the fact that emperors responded so violently suggests they were paying attention. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king himself, wasn't immune to this tension. Despite his personal devotion to Stoic ideals, his reign included the persecution of Christians who ironically shared some of those same ideals of endurance and moral clarity. Power, as always, complicates purity. You stroll now through the Senate House. It's quieter than you imagined. The walls are lined with carved names, many of them followed by years of exile, censure, or quiet disappearance. Philosophy was spoken here, yes, but so was fear. You can almost hear the pause before someone quoted Socrates a moment's breath to decide whether the emperor might take it as an insult. Still, the schools endured. New thinkers arose, they adapted. Middle Platonism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, and eventually Neoplatonism emerged not just as intellectual toys but as survival mechanisms. These weren't just ideas, they were escape routes, blueprints for how to live in a world where saying the wrong thing could mean the end of everything. And yet people still wrote, still gathered in candlelit rooms to discuss ethics and the cosmos and the role of the soul in a cruel empire. Because even if it was dangerous, philosophy offered something Rome's emperors could never fully control: interior freedom. Picture a woman in her villa teaching her daughter about the stoic idea of apatheia, not indifference, but tranquility, untouched by the chaos outside. She may not be in the Senate, but she is passing along a tradition more enduring than any decree. Or a young scribe in a scriptorium copying down a banned philosopher's words by hand, hiding the scroll beneath a basket of grain when soldiers arrive. He doesn't quote the emperor in his prayers, he quotes Epictetus, "If you want to be free, desire nothing that depends on others." These are not just sentimental flourishes, they happened. They happened enough times that we still have the scrolls, still have the ideas long after the palaces turned to dust. You walk through an empty courtyard now and you see it clearly. Roman emperors ruled with fear. Philosophers ruled with ideas. One kind of power died with its wielder. The other, well, you're still here, aren't you? Listening. Remembering. So the next time you hear that ancient philosophy was a luxury for toga-clad elites with too much wine and not enough battles, recall instead that it was once treated like treason, and that the price of virtue in imperial Rome was often a lonely death. But oh, what beautiful last words. The moon hangs high now, casting pale silver light across the tiled roofs and quiet porticos of the capital. The chaos of the forum has faded into the soft hush of private chambers and fire-warmed libraries. Here, in this nocturnal calm, emperors still pace. Because no matter how many legions you command, how many provinces you annex, or how many statues bear your likeness, sleep does not always come easy. That's where Galen enters your story, a Greek philosopher, yes, but also a physician, a dream interpreter, and something of an empire calmer. You follow him now down a candle-lit hallway lined with busts of past emperors, all of whom had aches and fears and indigestions of conscience. And Galen, with his scrolls and scalpels, tended to them not just with medicine, but with a soothing cocktail of logic and wonder. He was born in Pergamon in 129 CE, a city already thick with Greek culture and Roman ambition. From a young age, he studied philosophy alongside anatomy dissection, alongside dialectic. To Galen, understanding the soul required understanding the spleen, and the empire full of overstimulated rulers and overstretched armies needed both. You picture him now in the court of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, wrapped in furs, his brow heavy with thoughts of war, mortality, and probably taxes. Galen speaks calmly, offering not just pulse readings and herbal drafts, but also reflections on the harmony between the mind and the body. You cannot govern others, he might whisper, if your humours are out of balance. Quirky detail. Galen believed that laughter was critical for good digestion. He once advised a senator to attend comedic plays as treatment for a lingering stomachache. Historians still argue whether this prescription worked, but the senator's wife reportedly insisted it improved his mood. What makes Galen unique among Rome's thinkers is his fusion of disciplines. He wasn't just healing emperors' headaches, he was shaping how they thought about their own bodies, their mortality, their temperaments. His concept of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, wasn't just medical, it was philosophical. You could blame a bad decision on an excess of yellow bile and still keep your dignity intact. But Galen was more than just a philosopher with a thermometer. He wrote prolifically hundreds of treatises ranging from ethics to the anatomy of a pig's larynx. He believed in order, in harmony, in the symmetry of nature and reason, and emperors, for all their unpredictable moods, adored that. In a world driven by chaos, barbarian invasions, palace conspiracies, unpredictable crop yields, Galen offered a system, a map of the body, yes, but also a map of the soul. You now stand in his private study where herbs hang from the ceiling like incense-heavy garlands. A scroll is unrolled on the desk, his On the Usefulness of the Parts of the Body, a title so literal it makes modern readers smile. But within its precise descriptions is a worldview that nothing in nature is wasted, that every organ has purpose, that the emperor's restless insomnia is a solvable puzzle. And Galen solved it night after night with mixtures of honey and vinegar, with soothing words, and crucially with philosophy. He was fond of Plato, admired Aristotle, and often quoted Hippocrates like scripture. His medicine wasn't just treatment, it was dialogue. Even emperors who loathed being challenged found comfort in Galen's bedside manner. He knew when to speak and when to let silence be the balm. He could diagnose anxiety masked as divine visions, guilt veiled as gout, and he was smart enough to make each diagnosis sound like a compliment. One humorous incident: Galen once argued with another physician in front of the emperor over whether a particular fever stemmed from bile imbalance or a blockage of animal spirits. He won the debate, not with evidence, but with a calm stare and a story about a goat he once treated. The emperor laughed, declared him the victor, and immediately felt better. Still, not all were fans. Some accused Galen of arrogance, of believing himself the ultimate authority on nearly everything. And to be fair, he did write a book called That the Best Physician is Also a Philosopher. Subtlety was not his strong suit, but his results spoke for themselves. For nearly 3 centuries after his death, Roman and Byzantine physicians studied his works as gospel. Historians still argue whether Galen's system advanced medicine or slowed it down. His authority was so towering that later thinkers hesitated to challenge his claims, even when they were clearly wrong. But that too speaks to his legacy. He was not just a man, he was an institution, and his blend of Greek thought and Roman practicality lived on long after the fires of Rome dimmed. You walk now through the ruins of a military camp far from the capital. A soldier sick, scared, half-starved, is being treated by a field physician using Galenic methods: warm compresses, calming words, a short quote from Epictetus, whispered between coughs. The legacy lingers. Because Galen did what few others could, he made Greek philosophy palatable to Roman power, not by debating justice in the Senate, but by explaining the spleen in a way that made emperors feel seen, soothed, and slightly smarter than they really were. So the next time you hear someone say mind over matter, remember that Galen tried to stitch those two together. And somehow for a while it worked. The night deepens now, and Rome glows not with torches, but with ideals made marble. You pass beneath triumphal arches and along the grand promenades of Hadrian's era, where statues of virtue stare from pedestals as if caught mid-judgment. The empire is at its glittering height, its roads endless, its armies disciplined, its temples opulent, and yet the thing most carefully sculpted isn't military strategy or economic stability. Its image. Because now Greek philosophy becomes something else entirely. Not just a guiding light for emperors or a whispered cautionary tale in times of tyranny, it becomes propaganda, imperial branding dipped in Plato and polished with the calm serenity of stoic detachment. You walk beside Hadrian himself, a man of many contradictions. He was a military commander who preferred poetry, a builder of walls who wrote love songs, a ruler who openly wept for his Greek lover Antinous and then deified him in a fit of emotional devotion wrapped in philosophical rhetoric. And all the while Hadrian styled himself not just as Caesar, but as a philosophos basileus, a philosopher king. That idea came straight from Plato, of course, the belief that the ideal ruler wasn't the strongest or the richest, but the wisest, the one who understood justice in the abstract and then applied it to tax reform. It's a lofty ideal, and probably one that got Plato laughed out of more than one dinner party. But to Hadrian it was gold. He commissioned busts of philosophers held court with scholars, even shaved his beard like a proper Greek intellectual, starting a fashion trend for emperors that would last centuries. Quirky detail. Hadrian once summoned an entire school of philosophers from Athens to Rome just to consult on how to rewrite parts of Roman law. Most emperors changed laws by decree. Hadrian wanted a symposium. But this wasn't pure idealism, it was strategy. By cloaking himself in the robes of a thinker, Hadrian separated himself from the memory of Domitian and Nero, from capricious cruelty, from gladiator bloodlust. He wasn't just a man of power, he was a man of paideia, of education, culture, taste. He turned Greek wisdom into a kind of armor, a rhetorical shield against revolt and resentment. You step into the pantheon now, that great concrete whisper of the divine. The inscription still credits Agrippa, but this version, Hadrian's version, was built to inspire awe. Its dome opens to the sky, a philosophical eye staring into the heavens. Its geometry as theology. And Hadrian made sure it was surrounded by Greek statuary. Even the gods inside seem to be quoting Aristotle. Under Antoninus Pius, this trend continues. The emperor's rule is quite almost boring, which in Roman politics was a kind of miracle. He promoted virtue without violence, austerity without arrogance. Historians still debate whether he was truly virtuous or just a master of good PR, but the result was the same. The empire felt like it was in the hands of a man who read Epictetus before breakfast. And of course, Marcus Aurelius followed, the philosopher king ideal incarnate. With Meditations, he gave the world a rare thing, the internal monologue of an emperor trying desperately to be decent. He didn't publish it. He didn't even polish it. These were private thoughts scribbled while stationed at the freezing frontiers, reflecting on patience, pain, the fleeting nature of life, and the surprising amount of idiocy one encounters in a day. It wasn't meant to be read, and yet somehow it became the definitive expression of Stoic philosophy. And more than that, it became Roman imperial branding. The message was clear. We are not tyrants, we are thinkers. We do not rule by whim, but by wisdom. Whether or not that was true is almost beside the point. The point was that Rome needed it to seem true. You pass now through the Hall of Emperors, where busts stare into the void of history. Some look noble, others look like they were mid-sneeze when the sculptor froze them in time. But nearly all post-Hadrian wear beards. Philosophical beards, serious beards, not because they were all deep thinkers, but because image mattered. A clean-shaven tyrant was suspicious. A bearded emperor, however, evoked Plato, Socrates, and the contemplative murmur of a Greek lecture hall. And if you think this is shallow, well, Rome ran on symbolism. Everything was costume. The toga, the triumph, the laurel wreath, they were props in an ongoing performance of virtue. Greek philosophy gave that performance gravitas. A way to justify power not just with divine ancestry or military might, but with moral purpose. Quirky footnote: during imperial festivals, some emperors would have actors perform dialogues between Socrates and imaginary tyrants, comic biting and always flattering to the current regime. Nothing like a good state-sponsored roast of bad rulers past to remind people how lucky they were now. But here's the strange truth: despite the manipulation, despite the theatricality, some emperors did believe the philosophy, or tried to. Marcus Aurelius, for all his power, still worried about being impatient with servants, still reminded himself not to get angry when corrected, still feared becoming the kind of man he once despised. That's the double-edged sword of philosophical branding. You might start doing it for appearances, but sometimes the ideas actually take root. You sit now beneath a cypress tree outside the mausoleum of Hadrian, watching the Tiber slide by like time itself. The city is quieter here, less performance, more memory. And you wonder, was philosophy ever really about truth in Rome? Or was it always about what truth looked like? Historians still argue whether the Roman embrace of Greek thought was genuine or just clever decoration. But perhaps the answer doesn't matter, because when you read Marcus's scribbled notes, when you walk through a library Hadrian built, or hear the echo of Epictetus in a soldier's diary. What remains isn't image, it's influence. And that may be the most Roman thing of all. Now the city begins to exhale. Torches flicker low, fountains murmur into silence, and the marble colonnades cast long, thin shadows under a sky too ancient to care who rules beneath it. Your steps slow as you reach the quietest part of the empire, not a temple, not a senate house, but a scroll room. One lined with dust and dreams. Because long after the emperors crumble, it's the words that remain. The questions. The thoughts scratched into papyrus by candlelight, then copied and carried across centuries. You are in the company of ghosts now, not the vengeful kind, but the thoughtful ones. The ones who wore wool cloaks instead of armor, who preferred debating syllogisms to stabbing senators. Greek philosophers who never ruled anything larger than a lecture hall, yet somehow found themselves shaping the conscience of the most powerful empire the world had seen. Their names whisper from the spines of scrolls: Epictetus, Plato, Aristotle, Zeno. Their ideas became the real infrastructure of Rome, flowing through law, education, politics, even through the very way Romans talked about death. These thinkers didn't need legions, they had metaphors, and that was enough. You walk past a crumbling niche in a library wall where someone once hid a fragment of Epictetus during a book purge. It survived. The emperor who ordered the purge, forgotten. That's how philosophy works, it lingers. Not as dogma, but as a low hum beneath the noise of history. Take Marcus Aurelius again. His Meditations was never meant to be read by others. It was a personal discipline, a reminder to himself that he was mortal, fallible, and capable of being better. And yet today his words sit on nightstands around the world. Translated into languages he never heard, read by people he never imagined. Because good thoughts don't need borders. They don't even need marble. There's a scroll here, a rare one copy of a late letter from a student of Plotinus, a Neoplatonist, who believed that all things came from a single, ineffable source. The one, he called it. You might call it the universe, or meaning, or just sleep itself. And that's what these later philosophers tried to do, to weave together all the scattered pieces, Plato's ideals, Aristotle's logic, stoic endurance, into one system. One ladder for the soul. Quirky fact. Some Neoplatonists believed that true philosophers could leave their bodies during deep meditation and travel to higher realms of reality. Like the original out-of-office notification, but with astral projection. Emperor Julian the Apostate. Yes, that was his nickname, was one such admirer. He tried to revive pagan philosophy in a Christianizing empire. It didn't go well, but it was another echo of Rome's old habit. When in doubt, find a Greek thinker and ask for directions. And even as Christianity spread, much of early Christian theology absorbed Greek philosophy like water through cloth. Augustine, big fan of Plato. Aquinas later folded Aristotle into church doctrine like divine seasoning. Rome, the empire, may have died, but Rome, the idea, kept thinking in Greek. You turn now toward the cracked columns of a disused lecture hall, maybe in Ephesus, maybe in a forgotten corner of the Palatine. The benches are worn, the frescoes are faded, but if you close your eyes, you can still hear the voice asking questions about virtue, duty, the nature of justice, the fear of death. Not to win an argument, but to understand. Historians still debate the value of it all. Was Roman philosophy just Greek thought in a new tunic? Did emperors really learn or merely borrow to look smart? Were these ideas ever meant to survive the collapse of marble and law? But here's the thing they did. You can hear it in the way we talk about resilience, about self-control, about what it means to live a good life. These aren't just modern ideas, they're the aftershocks of lectures given to emperors who couldn't sleep, the thoughts of men who wore thin sandals and carried only questions. So now, with Rome behind you and the stars above you, settle onto a stone bench warmed by memory. The city is quiet. The scrolls are still. But the ideas, they hum beneath your breath, unbothered by centuries, unshaken by ruin. You sit with Plato, with Epictetus, with Marcus himself, and the empire, for all its columns and conquests, fades gently into a single enduring truth. And now, as we leave behind the marble corridors and flickering lamps of ancient Rome, your body softens into stillness. You've wandered through palaces and prisons, overheard whispers from emperors and barefoot cynics, and traced the long thread of thought that weaved itself through centuries of power, collapse, and quiet reflection. The scrolls close now, not with finality, but with the gentle hush of understanding. Let the rustle of parchment fade into the breeze through olive branches. Let the weight of questions, so many questions, lighten on your chest, like dust settling on a windowsill. These thoughts, these old Greek fragments nestled in Roman halls, they ask nothing of you now. You don't need to solve the mysteries of virtue tonight. You don't need to rule or advise or even decide what wisdom means. You've walked far enough, you've listened well, you've seen that even emperors wrapped in purple and surrounded by flame-lit statues needed something soft, a voice in the dark, a thought to hold on to when all else trembled. So let that voice linger in your ear as your breath slows. Let the quiet of the Roman night guide you deeper into calm. There's no more debating, no more conquering. Just the warm silence where thought once lived. Tomorrow will come, it always does. But tonight, you rest in the company of philosophers,